brass band. Yeah. Huh? Thank you, guys. There is a lot of talent in this church, in this ministry. And if you're not using yours, volunteer. Okay? So anyway, this morning, what I want to do is talk about forgiveness. Dare to forgive. And the reason I say dare to forgive is because sometimes we need to dare ourselves to forgive. Because sometimes we just don't want to be honest. I was coming in this morning and one person said to me, you're talking about forgiveness this morning. I am so glad you are because I need to work on that and I am working on it. My guess is that most people here could say that same thing. And so as we talk about forgiveness, the first thing I want you to do is just go to your heart space for a second. And as you go to your heart space, I want you to embrace yourself. I want you to love yourself. So that as we talk about this power of forgiveness, it is a power, that we do so in such a way that we are comfortable in our skins, comfortable with ourselves. And so, next slide, please. The question becomes, why is it so hard to forgive? You know, Paul said in Corinthians, bear with each other and forgive whatever grievances you may have against one another. Paul knew that the church that was in disagreement, that was dysfunctional, with people who were not willing to forgive, would be a church that would not stand very long. I don't see that here at Unity of Madison. What I see are forgiving folks, loving folks, caring folks, who seem to be living with one another in a way that is powerful, in a way that is admirable. Philip Yancey, in his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, told a story, and it kind of gets to the heart of why is it so hard to forgive. He said one night a couple, and I'm sure this doesn't apply to anybody here, but one night a couple got upset with each other. And they argued so strongly, got so upset, that they decided they would sleep in different bedrooms that night. 15 years later, they're still sleeping in separate bedrooms, each one wishing the other would come and apologize. Each one wishing that they really were together, holding each other in their arms. But you see, the ego was so strong that continued on. And then finally, one morning at breakfast, the wife says, I miss you. I really miss you. And I can't even remember what we argued about. Why don't we try to forgive each other? And they sat at the breakfast table, and they forgave one another by just releasing whatever it was that they thought they'd been wronged by. And they came together, and they were able to live life together and to be in the same bed once again. Forgiveness is kind of, what is forgiveness? It's kind of, each person has their own definition, I think, of forgiveness. Because each of us have different circumstances and different ways in which we catch ourselves being out of forgiveness, not willing to let go. And so when we start to look at this idea of what is forgiveness, then what can happen is that we can find many different ways to understand ourselves and to realize when we're not in the state of forgiveness. Vicki and I, and it doesn't happen as often as it used to, have a disagreement, and I say some silly thing that I shouldn't say, and we get upset with each other. Now, I know you haven't experienced that, so I'm just sharing it. And many years ago, we purchased 2 chairs that we had in our study, and we made an agreement. Anytime we got upset with each other, we would both go to those chairs, and the person who felt the strongest about what was happening would share what they were feeling and what was going on and why they felt that way. The other person, usually me, had to sit there and listen to it, okay? And they call that active listening. And I was able to do that, thank goodness, due to my wife, not myself. And so what happened is that by the time we finished discussing it, it might have taken 10 minutes or an hour, depending on how much stuff was behind it, what would happen is we would kind of forget what it was that brought us to the table, brought us to those two chairs. And I got to tell you that changed our marriage. We don't go to those chairs very often anymore. I think I'm getting wiser. But once in a while, it's still something happens, and we know where to go to resolve the difference. And so as we understand this idea of forgiveness, the next question we ask is, what is forgiveness? I believe that should come up. No, what are the effects of non-forgiveness? Not forgiving, thank you. So what are the effects? Well, a lot of studies have been on it. And I think if you have had really a situation where it's been difficult to forgive, you know what happens. The longer it goes on, the more it affects your health, actually. The longer it goes on, the harder it is to show up in the Christ presence because you're so wrapped up in ego. The longer it goes on, the more that you become difficult to live with. The longer that you hold forgiveness or non-forgiveness in your heart, it really interferes with your relationship with Spirit. Because Spirit comes through the heart space and into our lives to guide us and direct us so that we can be divine expressions. But when we're holding on to something so tightly, we don't want to let go, we aren't able to be that conduit because we're blocking something. And so forgiveness can have a great impact on us, and it can create a life that we really don't want to live. Charles Fillmore, the co-founder of Unity, said that and wrote about that every evening for a half an hour, he went through his day and he did forgiveness. If he thought it was the other person's, he would forgive them. But most of the time, he said, I found myself forgiving myself. And that's such a powerful, powerful idea. So as we allow ourselves to let go of the ego and not stew in anger and not take our feelings out on another person or another situation or the family dog, what we can do is go to that place within our heart where there is peace, and we can ask ourselves, what is mine to do in this situation? We can say, I do want to forgive. I do want to make a difference. And so the next slide here is a question, what can I do to be forgiving? And that's where I was going, and that's what I was talking about. So what is it that I can do to be forgiving? The Buddha said, holding on to anger is like grasping a hot coal with the intent of throwing it at someone else, and you're the one who gets burned, right? And so if that tells you anything, it says, look at yourself, look at your screen of life that we've talked about sometimes, and how am I showing up? And am I showing up in forgiveness manner, or am I showing up in a way in which I was angry? One of the hardest things I ever had to do was to forgive my ex-wife, because I was pretty convinced she was the problem, not me. And as I went through that forgiveness problem and went and talked with her, I found myself understanding that I was the one that created as many of the problems, and that I needed to forgive not only her, but to forgive myself. Frankly, she was quite stunned. She didn't even know what to say, because we had been apart for about 15 years. But I was still carrying it. I was still wrapped up in it in some ways that were not healthy, and I think it had an effect on my marriage with Vicki, to be honest. And I don't think she wanted to hear about it anymore, and I certainly didn't need to talk about it anymore. So I actually went to my former wife and asked her to forgive me for any part I played in being in a dysfunctional marriage. And since that time, I have found I can think about her with love, because we have 2 children. We're going to come in contact. That I can think about her as being who she is, the Christ presence. I can think about her as being someone who is living her life in a way that she's now finding joy in life. And I affirm that for her. And so as we look at this idea, what can I do to be forgiving? First of all, take the time. Take the time, like Charles Fillmore did, to learn to forgive. To just simply say, I release this. And I forgive the situation, or I forgive the person. The first time you say it, you may not feel any better. But if you say it more often, eventually one day, you're going to say, I forgive this situation, this person. And as I do, what happens is there's no emotion left in it. And what that means is that I've healed. The only challenge I have is I have to find another one deep down inside of myself, because they're there to do another process of forgiveness. But if you ask, it will come up for you. It can be uncomfortable at times, but it will come up for you. And so what we learn is that as we forgive ourselves, as we behold the Christ within ourselves, as we step into and embrace that idea, that as we do that, we find out that we are now starting to understand forgiveness in a different way. That what happens is that we are able to understand that it's not the other person we have to forgive. We have to understand the other person. We have to understand that they came from a different background, or different circumstances, have had different life experiences. And so when they irritate me, I call it the Lucy's in my life. When they irritate me, what happens is that I trigger. And I may keep it to myself because it's not socially proper to blast somebody, but I am doing that sometimes. And as I understand that, I can then own it. And as I own it, I can use the denial to say, this has no power over me. And when I do that enough, again, the forgiveness takes place. And you know who feels better? Me. The other person may even have forgotten what it is that I am holding them in judgment for. So we have to let go of our ego. We have to let go of the desire to judge. We have to let go of preconceived notions of how things ought to be. And we have to empathize with the person and learn from that person. During my years of ministry, I've had several circumstances where I needed to use the power and see forgiveness differently. And so as I look at that, what happens is that I end up following a path called Radical Forgiveness. It's a book by Colin Tipping. I took courses with him. I loved the book, and I know that it helped a lot of people over the years. But what happens is that if we have what we think is an adversary, we see them as in the way. And we see them as a problem. And then we've got forgiveness work to do because we're judging. If I understand that I don't have to forgive anybody for anything, that's not my business. That what I need to do is look for the opportunity of what that person is trying to teach me, that circumstance is trying to teach me. And when I do that, I am able to see myself, and I'm able to say, I forgive Richard. I behold the Christ in Richard. And you can do the same thing. There was a story, and let's go to the next slide because I think this is a story for it. Okay. What are the benefits of being a forgiving person? Corrie ten Boom, B-O-O-M, and her family resisted the Nazis by hiding Jews in their home. Eventually, they were caught and discovered, and they went to concentration camp. Matter of fact, the camp was Ravensbrück. And while they were there, she lost her whole family, but she, as said, barely survived. And one of the things that she did afterwards was that she shared with people her story, and that she was not allowing her story to hold her back. She was allowing it to be part of her life and to grow from the things that happened and the way she was treated and the loss of her family. And she was giving this talk when a individual stood up, and the man continued, his hand still extended. And he said to her, I was a guard there. I'm ashamed to admit it, but it's true. But since then, I've become a Christian. I've come to know Jesus and to understand Jesus' message of forgiveness, self-forgiveness. And Corrie gave her response in this book, in her book. And what she said, I stood there, I whose sins had again and again been forgiven, and I could not forgive in the moment. It could have been many seconds that he stood there with his hand held out. But to me, it seemed like hours. And I knew that I had to forgive, but even though it was simple and I felt horrible at the moment. She said, I stood there with coldness, clutching my heart, and so wounded that I could not stick my hand out. And she said, then for a moment, I realized that I was the one who was talking about forgiveness. So I had to put my hand out and shake his hand. And she said, in that moment, the most incredible thing took place. She said, the current started in my shoulder, raced down my arm, and sprang into our joint hands, and then the healing warmth seemed to flood my whole being, bringing tears to my eyes. I forgive you, brother, I cried, with all my heart. For a long moment, we grasped each other's hands, the former guard and the former prisoner. I had never known God's love so intensely as I did then. Non-forgiveness keeps us in bondage. Forgiveness releases us to experience ourselves and others with healthy regard and healthy relationships. And then the last statement up here is, does forgiveness guarantee reconciliation? Now that's really simple. No. If you need to do forgiveness from a family situation and that family member has made the transition, then you can't talk to them. You can talk to them, but you can't go to them and talk to them. What it's all about is making amends. You making amends with yourself and talking with the other person. One of the suggestions I have, you're really working on this thing, and you can't really go see the person, you can't be in front of the person, write them a letter. Now, the letter I want you to write is tell them how bad they are for interrupting your life. Tell them exactly how you feel about them in this moment. Let them know how bad they are. Let them know the damage they've done in your life. Put it all down in writing, but do not send that letter. Then after you've done that, because you see you're lifting things from your heart, you're bringing it out, write the letter that you were meant to write. And you may or may not mail it to them. But a letter that says, I forgive you. Please forgive me. A letter says that I love you just as you are. A letter that says, I understand and I care. All of us would love to get a letter from a family member or an individual that we've had a relationship that maybe has broken down through the years. And a letter like that will allow you to step out of bondage. And then I think the last one up here is Nelson Mandela. And what he said was, forgiveness liberates the soul. It removes fear. That's why it's such a powerful, powerful weapon. And so, on the next slide, there's some change there. And what we're looking at is let's just release and forgive others. Let's forgive ourselves. I'm going to end with the joke that I was going to start with. But it makes some sense. This minister was talking to his congregation about forgiveness one morning, and about 5-10 minutes into his message, which was going to be kind of long, he said, do you forgive? Do you forgive? Let me know. Raise your hands. And 30% of the people raised their hands. He continued to talk for another 10 minutes. Do you forgive? Do you forgive? Raise your hands. And another group raised their hands. And there were about 20% left. He said, this message will not be over until you say, I forgive, I forgive. And everybody but one lady raised her hand. Her name was Jody. He said, Jody, you don't have anybody forgive? And she said, no. He said, I want you to come up here and share with people why you can live that way. And what are you, 93 years old? I'm 93. How do you do that? She walked up front. She looked at the congregation. And she said, all the other hags are dead. Now, I don't know if that sets you up for meditation, but that's what we're going to do. So now, let's just take a moment. And let's just settle into a heart space. And as we are in that heart space, we breathe. We know that in our heart space, there is actually a second brain. A brain that is filled with spirit. A brain that gives us the understanding. A brain that reminds us of who we are. A brain that says, hug yourself, embrace yourself, love yourself in this very moment. And as you take a moment just to feel that and experience that love that you are, see yourself sitting on a bench. A bench that is surrounded by fall colors. And as you do, be prepared to greet a person from your past or in the present. And as they come forward to be on the bench with you, allow yourself to feel the pain that you might be feeling because this person hurt you. And sit with a moment which in your life you felt a relationship that might be damaging to you, a relationship that did not work for you, a relationship which needs to be healed. And knowing that the healing comes within you, from you, about you, that you can face that person and say, I forgive you. Please forgive me. And feel in this moment the love that is now generated through you, as you are in the silence. And take a deep breath. And you may say, this feels good. I feel alive. I feel Christed. And as we come out of this time of meditation, carry the with you. Know that you have done your work. And know that it's just that simple. To sit in beingness with another individual or a situation and say, I forgive. I let go. I let God. And so we give thanks for the power of elimination, the power to release and let go, the power to be the Christ in action, the power to forgive. And so it is. Namaste. Okay. Pete, I think it's up to you.